All right. Happy Thursday, folks. Hope everybody's day is going good. Getting up early this morning. And shout out to all the peeps out there like me awake on the graveyard shift in the wee hours. This is Michael, by the way, with your daily trivia question. Yet once again. All right, folks. Let's get right to it. Thank you, Ronnie James Dio. The answer to the previous trivia question was, if you weren't able to figure it out, taking control of Congress. And of course, we're talking about the 104th Congress from 1995. This was made up of the Senate and House of Representatives, of course, and met from January 3rd, 1995 to January 3rd, 1997. This occurred during the third and fourth years of Bill Clinton's presidency, his first term, in other words, right? Significant to this Congress was that both chambers had Republican majorities for the first time since the 83rd Congress in 1953. That was back in Eisenhower days, folks. And that was the focus of the trivia question. Also significant was the underlying ideology, platform, the overall legislative agenda, whatever you want to call it, that was being advocated at the time by the Republican Party. And this was, of course, called the Contract with America, if you're old enough to remember it, from the mid-90s. This represented the views of many, if not all, conservatives on the issues of reducing the size of government, cutting taxes, and both tort and welfare reform, all significant political agendas for the Republican Party and the GOP back in that day. One of the main authors of the Contract with America, or the author, as some have argued, was the one and only Newt Gingrich, who at the time was selected as Speaker of the House. He was the third person in charge of the country, folks. A lot of people don't realize that. And that being said, the Democrats did not like Newt Gingrich being the third person in charge of the country, being the Speaker of the House. He was not a popular person. And I'll get into a little bit more than that later. Gingrich got most of the main points of the Contract with America straight from Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address back in 1985. Good old Ronald Reagan. That was some past influence as far as the Contract of America goes. And from the conservative think tank called the Heritage Foundation, which also heavily influenced Gingrich and his ideology and his contract with America. That was the present influence at the time. So you had a kind of a combination of those combined with Gingrich's partisan politics mindset, and then you basically what you had was Contract with America. And of course, going into 1995, Congress was ruled by the Republicans. So there you go. Overall, the so-called contract detailed the actions the Republicans promised to take if they became the majority party in Congress, which of course they did, right? So what it wound up being at the end of the day, and from a political aspect, when all was said and done, was good old-fashioned partisan politics. And this was brutal partisan politics. For those of you who were alive back in 1995 and remember Gingrich versus Clinton, they did not like each other. And of course, Bob Dole got caught up in that mix as the majority leader. And remember, this was on the tail end of Clinton's first term. So Gingrich and the Republicans wanted the White House. There was an agenda behind the agenda, if you will. There was the whole thing had meaning, and he was setting his sights on higher things in the long run. Okay, again, you remember Bob Dole. Bob Dole was the majority leader. He was side by side with Gingrich they were both partisan politicians, staunch partisan politicians. I don't think people really realize that, even and especially back then. And Dole wanted the White House. Remember, Dole ran against Clinton, later on. So Dole was, of course, the majority leader who would go on, like I said, to run against Clinton in an all or nothing election campaign. He was going to run for the president, and whether he won or not, he was going to drop out from being a senator. And that's exactly what happened. Never came back to Washington, or politics, rather. Now, what this meant and boiled down to in the real world of things, right, as far as this political show of sorts played out, was two government shutdowns, as you can imagine, because neither Clinton or Gingrich or Dole or the Republicans or the Democrats were willing to reach across the aisle and compromise at all. One of the shutdowns lasted for 5 days. That was in late 1995. And the other one for 21 days at the beginning of 1996. And the one for 21 days was the longest at the time, longest government shutdown at the time until Donald Trump became president. I think his lasted over a month, right? So despite the shutdowns, there was a ton of legislation that got passed. And I think that gets overshadowed as well. If you go back and look at history and just Google or whatever, just on the surface, you'll see that a lot of legislation got passed, but none of it got the spotlight over the battle back and forth between Democrats and Republicans back then. Sometimes forgotten, in other words, in the limelight of things in terms of political fighting. Now, if you remember, in early 1997, the Lewinsky scandal broke, and none of that mattered because no one remembers anything after that, right? And it was all another whole show. So I'm just curious to know if you're old enough to remember the 104th Congress and the contract with America. I was I was younger, obviously. I was very impressionable, and I can tell you unapologetically right now, I got caught up in it. That's when I really started focusing and paying attention to politics, and I bought Gingrich's contract with America and the Republican Party really hook, line, and sinker. I was a big fan of Bob Dole because of his veteran status and because he portrayed himself as doing the right thing because it needs to be done, etc. All American. I voted for Dole back then, but I was known as a Gingrich Republican. I admit it to this day, and I think that a lot of it had to do with I really didn't realize how partisan of a politician that he was until I got older. I guess that's just the way it works. But I am old enough to remember that I got caught up in it. I was obsessed with the GOP, the Republican Party at the time. Well, what can I say? Gingrich has run for president multiple times since his stint in Congress. As we all know, we've seen him on the debates, right, and on the campaigns. He's taken some states in the gubernationals or whatever it's called, in the primaries and so forth. I think he got South Carolina one year, if my memory serves me correct. He's run for president a few times, and he's a frequent guest to this day on all kinds of political talking head programs. And folks, he's an author. He publishes a lot of books. But if you hear him talk, he is still to this day selling aspects of the contract with America, which just baffles me, because a lot of people walked away from that not liking that. They had a sour taste in their mouth over the whole so-called contract with America and the GOP's rule of the Congress back in 1995, the 104th Congress of the United States. All right, folks. Oh, my goodness, enough talk about politics. Let's get on with this Thursday. And maybe it'll cool off a little bit. I can't believe I said that. A couple of weeks ago, it was 8 degrees, and now it just feels like all humid outside. But that's North Carolina weather for you nonetheless, all right? Anyways, for January 5th, here's a brand new trivia question. On this day, in 2022, this was just last year, the governor of Louisiana granted a full and complete pardon for this person whose refusal in 1892 to leave a whites-only rail car led the Supreme Court to upheld state racial segregation laws in the United States for close to the next half century. Good luck, folks. Have a good Thursday. I'll see y'all next time. Peace out.